Well, I think a lot of people get married this way. We suddenly looked at each other, and I said, well, after we're married, why, we'll do this or that or the other. She didn't say no, so...
In the golden age of Hollywood, few men carried the quiet intensity of Humphrey Bogart. With his unmistakable voice, guarded expression, and unforgettable performances in films like Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon, he became one of the most iconic stars the world had ever known. To millions of fans, Bogart seemed untouchable, a man who never bent, never broke, and never let anyone get too close. But behind the smoke, the silence, and the carefully controlled image, his personal life told a very different story. He loved more than once. He married 4 times, and he lived through relationships that were often filled with conflict, distance, and regret. Yet in the final years of his life, one truth became impossible to ignore. Among all the women he had known, there was only one who truly brought him peace. And sometimes, the greatest love stories are not the loudest ones. They are the ones that finally make sense at the very end. Before we step into the private life of this Hollywood legend, tell me, when you think of Humphrey Bogart, which film do you remember most? Let me know in the comments. The safe beginning he never chose. Helen Menken. Before the fame, before the voice that would define a generation, before the world knew him as the man who never backed down, Humphrey Bogart was simply a young actor trying to find his place in a world that offered no guarantees. It was during this uncertain time that he married Helen Menken, a successful stage actress who already understood the rhythms of performance and the quiet sacrifices it demanded. On paper, it made sense. She was established. He was searching. Together, they looked like stability. But stability, as Bogart would later come to understand, is not the same as connection. Their marriage, which began in 1926, lacked the emotional depth that defines lasting love. There were no great betrayals, no dramatic collapses, just something far quieter, and perhaps more dangerous: indifference. Bogart admired her, respected her even, but something essential was missing. Something he couldn't yet name. At that point in his life, he didn't fully understand himself. How could he understand love? The relationship moved forward not because it was right, but because it was there. And in those early years, that was enough. Or at least, it seemed to be. But over time, the silence between them grew louder than any argument. The emotional distance widened, not through conflict, but through absence. Absence of passion, absence of vulnerability, absence of something real. By 1927, just a year later, the marriage quietly ended. No scandal, no headlines, just 2 people walking away from something that had never truly begun. And perhaps that was the first lesson Bogart never realized he was learning. Sometimes, the most dangerous relationships aren't the ones that break your heart. They're the ones that never touch it at all. The woman he left behind for Hollywood, Mary Phillips. After the quiet end of his first marriage, Humphrey Bogart did not immediately become the man the world would one day admire. In many ways, he was still searching for success, for identity, and, perhaps without realizing it, for a kind of love he had never truly experienced. It was during this uncertain period that Mary Phillips remained a steady presence in his life. Unlike his first marriage, this relationship carried something deeper: respect, familiarity, and a sense of shared struggle. Phillips was a serious actress, deeply rooted in the New York theater world, where discipline and dedication mattered more than fame. And for a time, they understood each other. They married in 1928, building a life centered not on glamour, but on ambition. Both were committed to their craft. Both believed in the slow, patient climb toward something greater. But what they didn't anticipate was how success would begin to pull them in different directions. As the 1930s unfolded, Hollywood came calling. For Bogart, it was an opportunity he could not ignore. The The film industry was expanding rapidly, offering roles, visibility, and the promise of something bigger than the stage could provide. But for Mary Phillips, New York was home. The theater was not just her career, it was her identity. And so, a quiet divide began to form. Bogart moved west. Phillips stayed behind. At first, the distance seemed manageable. Letters, occasional visits, the belief that love could stretch across miles. But distance has a way of revealing truths people try not to see. Conversations became shorter. Silences became longer. There was no great betrayal, no dramatic ending, only the slow realization that they were no longer building the same life. By the time Bogart began establishing himself in Hollywood, the marriage had already begun to fade. Not with anger, but with resignation. In 1937, after nearly a decade together, they divorced. And perhaps, for the first time, Bogart made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He chose ambition over attachment. Sometimes, we don't lose love because it fails. We lose it because something else becomes more important. The love that turned into war. Mayo Methot. By the time Humphrey Bogart met Mayo Methot, something inside him had already begun to harden. The disappointments of the past, the quiet endings, the emotional distance, none of it had broken him, but it had changed him. He was no longer searching for stability. And perhaps that is why Mayo Methot felt different from the very beginning. She was not calm, she was not predictable. She was intense, emotional, and fiercely alive. Where his previous relationships had been quiet, this one burned. And for a man who had spent years feeling disconnected, that intensity felt like something real. They married in 1938. At first, their passion seemed undeniable. Friends described a relationship filled with energy, late nights, laughter, and a kind of closeness that felt immediate. But intensity has a cost, and slowly, that same fire began to consume everything around it. Alcohol became a constant presence in their lives. Arguments, once small, grew louder, then sharper, then impossible to ignore. Hollywood began to notice. They were no longer just a couple. They became known as the battling Bogarts. Fights spilled into public view. Voices raised behind closed doors turned into broken glass, slammed doors, and nights that ended in silence instead of reconciliation. At times, the conflict became physical. Two people locked not in love, but in something far more destructive. And yet, they stayed. Because somewhere beneath the chaos, there was still attachment, still history, still the belief, perhaps misguided, that intensity meant depth. But over time, something changed in Bogart. The fire that once drew him in began to exhaust him. By the early 1940s, his career was finally rising. Films like The Maltese Falcon were transforming him into a major star. On screen, he became controlled, composed, untouchable. But off-screen, his life was unraveling. And perhaps, for the first time, he began to understand something he had never fully faced before. This wasn't love. It was conflict. By 1945, the marriage finally ended, not with quiet resignation like before, but with relief. Because some relationships don't teach you how to love. They teach you what love should never feel like. The woman who changed everything. Lauren Bacall. By 1944, Humphrey Bogart had already lived through enough to make most men cautious. 2 failed marriages behind him. 1 deeply toxic relationship still unraveling. A rising career that demanded control, discipline, and distance. On the surface, he had become the man audiences admired. Calm, sharp, emotionally untouchable. But beneath that image, something in him had grown tired. And then, unexpectedly, she walked onto the set of To Have and Have Not. Lauren Bacall was only 19 years old. She was new to Hollywood, inexperienced, and standing across from a man who was already a legend. The age difference alone, over 25 years should have made their connection unlikely. Impossible even, but something happened between them that neither of them had planned. It didn't begin with drama. It didn't begin with intensity. It began quietly. Between takes, they talked, not about fame or success, but about life, about uncertainty, about the strange feeling of not quite belonging, even when the world was watching. Bacall, despite her youth, carried a calm confidence, an emotional steadiness that Bogart had never experienced before. And for the first time in years, he listened. What started as conversation became a connection, and that connection slowly deepened into something far more personal. There was only one problem. Bogart was still married to Mayo Methot. In another chapter of his life, this might have become just another complicated situation, another overlap, another mistake. But this felt different, not because it was easier, but because it was clearer. With Bacall, there was no chaos, no shouting, no emotional instability. There was calm. And that calm forced Bogart to confront something he had avoided for years: the difference between intensity and peace. By the time his marriage to Methot ended in 1945, the choice had already been made, not out of impulse, but out of understanding. Because for the first time in his life, Bogart wasn't drawn to a woman who matched his chaos. He was drawn to a woman who quieted it, and in that quiet, something inside him began to change. The only love that felt like home. Lauren Bacall. When Humphrey Bogart married Lauren Bacall in 1945, many in Hollywood didn't quite believe it would last. The age gap alone raised eyebrows. The timing, so soon after the collapse of his previous marriage, only added to the doubt. And yet, what followed was something no one had truly seen from Bogart before. He changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily, almost as if he had finally stopped fighting something inside himself. With Bacall, life no longer revolved around tension or unpredictability. Instead, it settled into something far more rare in Hollywood: stability. They built a life together that extended beyond film sets and public appearances. At home, away from the cameras, Bogart was no longer the guarded man audiences imagined. He laughed more. He listened more. He allowed himself to be present in a way he never had before. Friends who visited them often noticed the difference immediately. There was no performance between them, no emotional games, just a sense of ease that felt natural, almost effortless. They worked together on films like The Big Sleep and Key Largo, where their chemistry became legendary. But what audiences saw on screen was only a reflection of something much deeper off-screen. This was not the kind of love that demanded attention. It was the kind that gave it. In time, they had 2 children, and fatherhood brought another quiet transformation in Bogart. The man once defined by distance and detachment began to embrace something softer, something more grounded. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, success no longer felt like something he had to chase, because he already had what he had been searching for. Not excitement, not intensity, but peace. And that peace changed everything. The chaos of his past relationships began to feel distant, almost unreal, compared to the life he now lived. The arguments, the instability, the emotional exhaustion, they no longer defined him. Because real love, as he was finally beginning to understand, does not pull you into conflict. It gives you a place to rest. And in Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart had finally found something he had never truly known before: a home, the final days, and his last truth. By the mid-1950s, the life Humphrey Bogart had built, the career, the reputation, the quiet happiness he had finally found, began to face something he could not control. His health was failing. The man who had once seemed indestructible on screen was now confronting a reality far more fragile. Diagnosed with cancer, Bogart entered the final chapter of his life, with the same outward composure the world had always admired. But behind that composure, there was something different now. Clarity. The noise that had once filled his life, the ambition, the conflicts, the restless searching, had faded. What remained was simple, and in that simplicity, one truth stood above everything else. Lauren Bacall was still there. She stayed beside him through the long days and the quieter nights, through the uncertainty, through the moments when even words were no longer necessary. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just presence, steady, constant, unshaken. Friends who visited during those months often noticed the same thing. Bogart, a man once defined by distance, now allowed himself to be vulnerable in a way he never had before. He spoke less about films, less about success, and more about the life he had lived, and the mistakes he had finally come to understand. There was no bitterness in those reflections, only recognition. He had known different kinds of relationships, some quiet, some distant, some destructive. But only one had brought him peace. Only one had remained when everything else began to fall away. And in those final days, that truth no longer needed explanation. It was visible in the way he looked at her, in the silence they shared, in the absence of everything that had once complicated his life. When Humphrey Bogart passed away in 1957, Lauren Bacall was still the one beside him. Not as a symbol of Hollywood romance, not as part of a public story, but as the woman who had stayed. And perhaps that is the simplest truth he left behind. After a lifetime of searching, of mistakes, of love that often felt incomplete, the only love that truly mattered was the one that remained at the end. The life of Humphrey Bogart reminds us that even the strongest men spend years searching for something they don't fully understand. Through ambition, failure, and love that often felt like conflict, he lived many versions of a life, but only one brought him peace. In the end, it wasn't the loudest love that mattered, not the most passionate, not the most dramatic. It was the one that stayed. And maybe that leaves us with a quiet question. Do we recognize true love when it comes, or only when it's almost gone? If you enjoy timeless Hollywood stories like this, consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting, and some of them may feel closer to your own life than you expect.